I don't remember the day they left me, but I've imagined it more times than I can count. A hospital hallway echoing with quiet footsteps, a nurse humming softly, a clipboard being signed with a name that was never meant to stay. I picture my mother looking back one last time, my father standing beside her pretending not to care. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they convinced themselves that leaving was an act of mercy. Whatever their reason, it became my beginning, a blank birth certificate and a story no one wanted to finish. My name back then was temporary, scribbled in blue ink by a nurse who said every child deserved at least one word to call their own. The foster system became my version of family. 10 houses before I turned 15. Some were kind, most were cold, and all had rules about how far you were allowed to dream. I learned to stay quiet, to make my own meals, to fix what broke before anyone noticed. If you were lucky, you got people who wanted the monthly check, more than they wanted control. If you weren't, you learned early that love could have conditions. I told myself stories to stay sane. I pretended my parents were searching for me. That maybe someday I'd see their faces in a crowd. That illusion carried me further than food ever could. When I turned 18, the illusion cracked. No one came. No letter. No call. Just a folder from the social worker and a small box of things that didn't belong to me. That's when I met Henry. He was volunteering at the youth center downtown, fixing computers for kids who couldn't afford new ones. He had that calm, steady energy, the kind that made a room feel less dangerous. He didn't talk much at first, just offered advice in quiet sentences. "Never let them convince you that kindness is weakness," he once said while adjusting a monitor. I didn't know it then, but those words would build the foundation of everything that came after. Henry didn't ask about my past. He asked about my future. He taught me how to budget, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to stand my ground without apology. Over time, we fell into a rhythm. Sunday coffees, weekend repairs, midweek phone calls. He'd tell me stories about his old engineering projects and the house he built by hand in the outskirts of town. There were pictures of him with his son and daughter, my parents smiling like they had everything. One day, I asked why he didn't see them anymore. He paused, stirred his coffee, and said, "Some people only love you when you're useful. The trick is to stop being their tool." It wasn't until I was 21 that he told me the truth. He knew who I was. My parents had abandoned me when I was a baby, and he'd kept track through the foster system, making sure I was safe without interfering. He said he'd wanted to step in but knew the law wouldn't allow it. "When they walked away from you, they walked away from me too," he said quietly. "But I'm here now, if you'll have me." From that day forward, he became my family. No adoption papers, no formal titles, just a bond built on choice, not obligation. When Henry passed away, I was 28. It was sudden, a heart attack while he was working in his garden. The world went silent for a while. I handled the funeral alone. My name was the only one listed under family. A week later, his lawyer called me in for the reading of the will. I expected maybe the house or some small inheritance. What I didn't expect was everything. His savings, his investments, the estate worth $3.4 million. He'd left it all to me. For a while, I couldn't even touch it. It didn't feel real. I thought about the years he'd spent teaching me how to live, not how to spend. But before I could even begin to grieve, the vultures appeared. A formal letter, cold and precise, from a law firm in another city. It stated that 2 individuals were contesting the will: Henry's biological children. My parents. The ones who had abandoned him, and me. The same people who hadn't shown up to his funeral, now demanding what he'd left behind. The first hearing was surreal. They walked in like actors on a stage, my mother in designer black, my father wearing an expression rehearsed for sympathy. They didn't even look at me at first. When the judge asked them to identify themselves, my mother turned slightly, her eyes scanning my face like she was searching for something familiar. "I suppose that's her," she said to their lawyer. The girl. The girl. Not their daughter. Just a placeholder again. Their argument was simple and cruel. They claimed I'd manipulated Henry in his old age, that I'd taken advantage of his grief over losing contact with his children. Their lawyer painted me as a desperate orphan, clinging to an old man for security. Every sentence they spoke felt like sandpaper against a wound that never healed. But I sat there quietly, my hands steady on the table, because I had something stronger than their lies, Henry's truth. A week before he died, he'd written me a letter. It wasn't long, just a single page folded neatly in an envelope marked, "In case I'm gone." I hadn't opened it until the night before the hearing. It said, "If you're reading this, I didn't get to say goodbye. I need you to remember something. The people who abandoned you will come back when they realize they can profit from what they left behind. Don't let them take what you've built. You earned your place in this world, not through blood, but through courage." I carried that letter in my bag to every hearing. It became my armor. Every insult, every lie, every fake tear they shed only reminded me of how right Henry had been. When their lawyer claimed that my relationship with Henry was unnatural, I looked him in the eye and said, "You're right. It was unnatural for him to love me without conditions. But he did. Maybe that's what you can't stand." After that day, the tone shifted. Their confidence cracked. They hadn't expected me to fight back. They thought the same silence that defined my childhood would define my defense. They were wrong. Because I wasn't that abandoned baby anymore. I was Henry's granddaughter, by choice, not blood. The case dragged on for weeks. They tried to intimidate me, sending letters through their lawyer, making threats about ruining my reputation. But the truth has a way of fighting back, especially when it's backed by evidence. Henry's lawyer, Mr. Duncan, had documentation of every transfer, every message, every declaration Henry had made about his estate. There was no manipulation, no deception, only gratitude. Still, something inside me knew it wasn't over. People like my parents don't stop when they lose money. They stop when they lose control. And control was the only thing they'd ever truly wanted. The night before the final hearing, I dreamed about Henry again. He was in his garden, smiling, holding the same coffee mug he used every Sunday. He didn't say much, just looked at me the way he always did, like I'd already won. When I woke up, the letter was still on my nightstand, and I finally understood what he meant. Winning wasn't about keeping the money. It was about keeping my peace. So when I walked into court that last morning, I wasn't scared anymore. I knew who I was, and no amount of blood or betrayal could rewrite that. My parents had abandoned a baby, but they'd underestimated the woman she'd become. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe it was just the energy of two people pretending to be victims in a story they'd written themselves. My parents sat across from me at the long mahogany table, their lawyer whispering strategies like poison behind polished teeth. My mother wore pearls, because of course she did. She always had a flair for dramatics, even when I was a name on a paper she'd left behind. My father looked older than I imagined, gray hair slicked back. That same forced dignity of a man who had mastered the art of denial. When the judge entered, everyone stood. I stayed calm. I'd spent weeks preparing for this day, not just with lawyers and documents, but with memories. Every conversation with Henry, every detail he'd shared about the house, the will, the people he'd once called family, they were my evidence. The first half hour felt like theater. Their lawyer painted them as heartbroken parents who had lost contact with their child due to misunderstandings, who had then been shocked to learn that their father had been manipulated by an outsider. Me. The words were so polished they almost sounded true. He talked about my background like it was proof of guilt. The foster homes. The lack of family ties. He called me unstable. He called me opportunistic. He said Henry had been old, lonely, easily influenced. That I had inserted myself into his life to gain control over his estate. Every word felt like a nail, hammered in rhythm, but I didn't flinch. The judge watched me carefully, as if waiting to see if I'd break. I didn't. I waited for my turn, and when it came, I didn't use anger. I used truth. I told the court about the Sundays at the diner, about the books Henry gave me, about the nights he sat beside me while I studied for exams. I told them how he'd shown up at my college graduation with a camera so old it still used film. I told them about the time he taught me to fix the engine in his truck because you shouldn't have to wait for someone else to save you. And I told them how, when my car broke down on a freezing January night, he was the one who drove 3 hours just to make sure I wasn't alone. There was no manipulation in those stories. Just love. Genuine, unconditional love. And the courtroom went silent because even they could feel it. My mother's mask started to crack. Her lips tightened. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering, her hands trembling slightly. My father avoided my eyes completely. Then came the turning point. Henry's lawyer, Mr. Duncan, stood and presented the original will. It was signed, notarized, and witnessed. He handed it to the judge along with a sealed envelope. Your Honor, he said, this is a letter Mr. Lowell instructed me to deliver to the court if this will was ever contested. The envelope looked old, the kind of paper that yellows from time and truth. The judge opened it carefully and began to read aloud. The letter wasn't long. Henry wrote about how he'd been abandoned by his own children, how he'd spent years trying to reconnect only to be ignored. He wrote that the only person who had shown him loyalty, compassion, and care without expectation was me. He said I reminded him of the man he used to be before disappointment hardened his heart. And then came the line that changed everything. If my children ever question my decision, let this be clear: I am leaving my estate to the only family that stayed when everyone else walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face turned pale, and my father finally looked at me, not with love, not even with regret, just recognition, the kind that comes too late. Their lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping through papers as if hoping for a loophole to appear. There wasn't one. The letter had been witnessed, time-stamped, and authenticated. There was no doubt, but they weren't finished. My mother stood up suddenly, breaking decorum. She accused me of forging the letter, of working with Henry's lawyer to steal what was rightfully theirs. Her voice rose, sharp and frantic, as if volume could replace evidence. The judge ordered her to sit down twice before finally threatening to clear the courtroom. She sat, seething, whispering to my father, who kept his head low. When it was my turn again, I handed over a USB drive to Mr. Duncan. He plugged it into the courtroom screen and played a video. Henry had recorded it 6 months before his death. His voice filled the room, calm and steady. If you're watching this, he said, then I'm gone, and I suspect the vultures are circling. He smiled slightly. You can't forge love. You can't fake time. And no one can buy sincerity. Dominica is my family, because she earned it, not because she demanded it. The room stayed silent as the video ended. I could hear my mother breathing heavily, her carefully curated image unraveling in front of strangers. The judge took a long pause, then said softly, I think we've seen enough for today. But before the session adjourned, something unexpected happened. My father stood up, shaking slightly. He said, Henry was a stubborn man, he cut us off, but we're still his blood. The judge asked him to sit, but he kept talking. We were young. We made mistakes. But that doesn't mean she deserves everything. His voice cracked on that last word. Everything. That was the truth hiding beneath their performance. They didn't want justice. They wanted control. When the judge finally dismissed everyone, I walked past them without a word. My mother called my name, but it sounded foreign coming from her. I didn't stop. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharp and clean, like the world had been scrubbed of illusion. Reporters waited by the steps, cameras flashing, asking if I had anything to say. I told them the truth. You can't lose what you never had. You can only protect what you've built. That night, I went home and opened Henry's letter again. The words didn't just feel like a defense anymore. They felt like a legacy. He'd known this day would come. He'd known the same people who left me would try to come back when there was something to gain. But what they didn't understand was that inheritance isn't money or property. It's resilience. It's peace. It's the ability to walk away without bitterness. Still, I wasn't naive. People like them don't accept defeat easily. And deep down, I knew this battle wasn't finished. I'd seen the look in my mother's eyes as she left the courtroom, the kind of look that promised war disguised as grief. They'd lost the case, but not their obsession. And I was about to learn just how far they'd go to rewrite history. Because a week later, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a copy of Henry's will, the one I already had, but with one horrifying difference. My name was missing. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, folded neatly in a cream envelope with no return address. The handwriting looked familiar, elegant, deliberate, my mother's kind of handwriting, The kind that always tried to make ugliness look beautiful. When I opened it, my stomach turned. Inside was a photocopy of Henry's will, but something was wrong. My name, the one that had been typed clearly beside every asset and property line, was missing. Replaced by two names I knew all too well, theirs. My parents. My first thought was disbelief. My second was realization. They hadn't given up. They were rewriting history one forged document at a time. I called Mr. Duncan immediately. He told me to bring it in, that we'd verify the source and check for legal implications. When I arrived at his office, he examined the document under a magnifying glass. After a few seconds, he looked up, grim. "They're getting desperate," he said quietly. "This isn't a copy of anything that ever existed. It's been fabricated. The signatures are traced. And the notary stamp is counterfeit." He slid the page back toward me like it was contaminated. "We'll report it, but you should prepare yourself. This isn't about money anymore. It's about control." He was right. It wasn't just greed. It was about rewriting the narrative, making me the fraud and them the victims. The next morning, my phone started buzzing. Articles, blog posts, online gossip. Someone had leaked a new version of the will to a tabloid, claiming I'd used emotional manipulation to steal millions from my grieving parents. They called me a gold digger, a con artist, a fake daughter. Every word hit like static against my chest. My mother's media contacts had done their job well. She was playing the victim perfectly. The comments were worse. Strangers picking sides in a story they didn't know. She probably tricked that old man. No real parent would cut out their child unless they had a reason. It was all the same noise. But I'd learned how to survive noise a long time ago. You survive it by staying silent until silence becomes power. Mr. Duncan filed a defamation complaint and hired a forensic investigator to trace the document's source. Within a week, we had proof. The forgery had been created on my father's work computer, the IP address traced directly to their home. Even the metadata from the scanned file contained my mother's initials. It was sloppy, rushed, desperate. But they'd already achieved what they wanted: attention. The damage to my reputation was done. Still, I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I started gathering everything. Every voicemail, every text, every letter they'd sent since the lawsuit began. I built a file so detailed it could have been a documentary script. Because part of me knew people like them don't stop unless they're stopped completely. And the only way to stop them was to let the truth speak louder than their lies. One night, I was sitting in Henry's old study, surrounded by his books and the faint smell of cedar, when I found something I hadn't noticed before. A sealed envelope taped beneath the drawer of his desk. My hands shook as I peeled it away. Inside was another letter, dated 3 months before his death. It began, simply, "If you're reading this, it means they've come back." My breath caught as I kept reading. He wrote about how he suspected his children might try to challenge the will, that they'd always been obsessed with appearances, with money, with control. Then came the line that changed everything. "I've left a safety key in the clock. Use it if you ever need to prove who I trusted." The clock. I looked up. It was an antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room, its pendulum frozen since the day he died. I pulled open the small door at the base and reached inside. There, taped behind the brass mechanism, was a tiny USB drive in a plastic sleeve. I plugged it into my laptop, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the quiet tick of the clock. The folder opened instantly. Videos, scanned letters, bank receipts. Every piece of proof showing that Henry had intentionally left his estate to me, that he'd discussed it openly, legally, and transparently. But that wasn't all. There were also videos, dated entries he'd recorded himself, documenting conversations with his children. Conversations that exposed their greed. One video, from a year before his death, showed my mother sitting across from him in that same study. Her tone was sweet at first, almost performative. "Dad, it's been so long. We should reconnect," she said, smiling. Henry just nodded, unimpressed. Then she added, "I heard you've been spending time with that girl from the youth center. Dominica, is it? It's so nice that you're helping people again." Her smile tightened when he didn't respond. Then her voice dropped. "Just don't let her take advantage of you." You've always been too trusting. Henry laughed softly. She's the only one who hasn't tried to. The camera shook slightly as he adjusted it, but the emotion in his voice was steady. She's family, even if she wasn't born into it. That one line was enough to destroy their entire case. Mr. Duncan was speechless when I showed him the footage. This is ironclad, he said, his eyes wide. Not just for the inheritance, but for the criminal side. If we file this, they're done. I nodded, but something inside me hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to destroy them. Part of me still wanted them to admit it, to look me in the eye and confess what they'd done. But deep down, I knew people like them never confess. They justify. The next court hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In that time, I stayed quiet. No social media, no interviews, no responses. The silence made them nervous. Their lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to delay the inevitable. When the day finally came, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, relatives, curious onlookers. My parents sat side by side, holding hands for the cameras, a perfect picture of unity built on lies. When the judge entered, the tension was thick enough to taste. Mr. Duncan began calmly, his tone measured. He presented the forged will, the metadata proof, and finally, the USB drive. He explained that the videos were authenticated, time-stamped, and verified by digital forensic experts. Then he played them one by one. The courtroom watched Henry speak from beyond the grave, his voice calm, his reasoning crystal clear. When the video of my mother played, she went white. My father sank lower in his seat. By the time the last video ended, no one said a word. The judge looked at them both for a long moment before finally speaking. You've wasted this court's time with deceit and manipulation. The evidence presented proves beyond question that this will is valid, and your actions constitute an attempt to defraud not only this estate but your own family. She turned to me then. Miss Hartley, I'm sorry you had to go through this. Mr. Lowell clearly loved you very much. The gavel came down, final and heavy. I'd won. But as I walked out of that courtroom, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Because victory doesn't erase the fact that your own parents tried to ruin you. It doesn't fix the years they left you wondering why you weren't enough. It doesn't bring back the childhood they chose to abandon. It just confirms what you already knew, that some people only come home when there's money waiting on the doorstep. That night, I sat by the window of Henry's house, watching the city lights flicker. I thought about the little girl who once believed family meant safety. I thought about the woman she became, the one who learned that love, real love, doesn't leave and sue you later. And I realized something powerful. They hadn't taken anything from me. They'd only shown me how strong I'd become without them. Winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something you never built but were forced to defend. The news spread faster than I expected. Within hours, articles flipped the narrative, calling it one of the most shocking inheritance frauds of the decade. Overnight, I became the girl who beat her parents in court, the orphan who refused to be erased. Reporters called non-stop, podcasts wanted interviews, and my inbox filled with strangers telling me I was brave. But bravery doesn't feel like much when you're sitting alone in a house that used to echo with someone else's voice. Henry's voice. The first few nights after the verdict, I barely slept. Every corner of the house carried his presence, the clock, the garden, the coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen shelf. It should have felt like closure, but closure is a myth people tell themselves when they don't know what to do with their pain. What I really felt was peace mixed with grief, like two opposite truths learning to coexist. My parents' lawyer filed one last appeal out of pride, but it was dismissed almost instantly. The forgery charges moved forward, and suddenly, the people who once called me a liar were now defendants in a criminal trial. When the subpoenas arrived at their doorstep, the silence that followed was deafening. My mother tried to call me twice. I didn't answer. Then came the letters, long, dramatic apologies filled with half-truths and excuses. She said she was manipulated by my father, that she never meant for things to go that far, that she was scared of losing everything. I read them all once, then put them in a box labeled, "For the past." My father didn't write at all. The last thing I heard about him came from an article he'd hired a new lawyer, one who specialized in reputation recovery. Even in disgrace, he was still trying to control the narrative. The trial moved faster than anyone expected. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the fake notary seal, the metadata proof, and the videos Henry left behind. The judge didn't even let it drag out. My mother was sentenced to 5 years for fraud and conspiracy. My father received 3. They both cried in court, though not for what they'd done, but for being caught. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see their faces to understand that justice had already been served the day the truth came out. After that, life became quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of abandonment, the silence of peace. I started working with Henry's lawyer to create something he'd always wanted. A scholarship fund for kids aging out of the foster system. We called it the Lowell Promise. Every year, it would fund education and housing for 5 young adults with no family support. It was the kind of legacy Henry would have loved, not money sitting in a bank, but hope passed forward. A few months later, I found myself standing in front of a group of those students. They were nervous, just like I used to be, clutching folders and papers, trying to look confident while carrying years of invisible weight. I told them my story, not the viral version, not the headline, but the truth. That family isn't the people who give you life, it's the people who give you safety. That sometimes, the people who abandon you are the ones who teach you how to stand alone. When I finished, one of the girls raised her hand and asked, "Do you forgive them?" I paused for a long moment before answering. Forgiveness isn't about letting them back in. It's about letting yourself move on without carrying their shadows. That night, I went back to the house. The garden had started to bloom again, wildflowers creeping through the cracks in the path. The air smelled like rain. Inside, everything was still. I made tea, the way Henry used to, with too much sugar and a slice of lemon. Then I walked to the study, where his old desk still stood. On top of it sat the clock, the same one that had hidden the USB drive that changed everything. I wound it up for the first time since he died. The pendulum began to swing again, slow and steady, marking the rhythm of a life that had come full circle. As the seconds ticked by, I thought about that first day in court, about the little girl who once waited for parents who never came. That version of me had lived so long in survival mode that she forgot what it felt like to simply exist without fear. But sitting there, listening to the clock, I realized she was finally safe. She didn't need anyone to come back. She didn't need apologies or explanations. She didn't need to prove she was worthy of love. She already was. The news eventually moved on. Other stories replaced mine, louder scandals, new tragedies. My parents' names faded from the headlines. And for the first time in my life, anonymity felt like freedom. I started writing again, small essays about resilience and identity, about how sometimes the people who hurt you the most give you the gift of clarity. My words began to travel farther than I expected. People wrote to me from all over, telling me they'd been disowned, abandoned, forgotten. They said my story made them feel seen. One evening, I received an email from a woman I'd never met. She said she used to work at the hospital where I was born. She remembered the day my parents left. She said she'd been the nurse who wrote my name on the birth certificate, the one word that gave me a beginning. She ended her message with, "I'm glad you found your ending." I read it 3 times before realizing I was crying. Not out of sadness, but gratitude. Because somehow, through all the loss and betrayal, life had come full circle. Months passed, seasons shifted. And then one morning, I drove out to the old cemetery where Henry was buried. I brought him fresh lilies, his favorite. The air was still, the kind of quiet that feels sacred. I stood there for a long time before speaking. "You were right," I said softly. "They came back when there was something to gain. But they can't take anything from me now. You gave me more than money. You gave me the kind of family no bloodline could ever replace." The wind moved through the trees like a whisper. I smiled, not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that comes from peace. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed a message from one of the scholarship students. It said, "I got the job. Thank you for believing in me." I looked up at the sky and whispered, "We did it, Henry." Driving home, I realized the story had never really been about revenge or inheritance. It was about reclaiming something far greater: dignity, identity, and the quiet power of being enough. Because sometimes, the greatest justice isn't what the court decides. It's what your heart finally accepts, that you don't owe love to those who abandoned you. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the stars blink through the dark. The clock inside ticked softly, steady and certain. I lifted my cup of tea to the sky and whispered one last truth. You may have left me, but I found myself. And that's the inheritance you can never steal.